record though. Now, welcome everyone to the Garden to Table Hour with Garden to Table Nutrition. We are so glad you could join us today. If you are a preceptor, please let me know in the chat that you are wanting CPEs. I may not grab all of your names, but I would like to introduce you to Merri. You read her bio in the announcement, but she can introduce herself and tell you about her journey to where she is today. Thanks for coming, Merri.
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. It's fun for me to speak to dietitians and soon-to-be dietitians because I don't usually get to talk to this kind of group. And I've kind of, as you'll see, taken a little bit of a career shift, at least while I'm in my doctoral program. And so it's fun for me to meet with all of you. And on that same, line, I thought I would give a little bit of background on my path to where I am, just because I know when I was an intern, I really liked hearing those sorts of stories. There's a little bit of like inspiration and also learning what is out there as far as career opportunities. And so I started as a dietetic intern at UCSD Medical Center. It was actually their second dietetic intern class, and now I think they're in like their 10th or 11th class, so it's doing well, but it was mostly a clinical focus. And from there, I worked as a clinical dietitian for 2 years at a hospital in San Diego, and then switched to eating disorder treatment. I'd kind of always been interested in eating disorders, but it's a hard field to get into until you have experience. It's sort of like that catch-22. And so I found an opportunity in Tucson, Arizona, where they were willing to train someone who didn't have a lot of experience. And so I worked as a residential eating disorder treatment dietitian there for 2 years, and then decided that I kind of noticed that jobs I was interested in were requiring a master's degree. And I know that now there's it's going to be a requirement soon, 2024, I think, to have a master's degree. So whenever I was kind of getting into it, that wasn't a requirement. And I realized that it was going to kind of be a good idea for me to get a graduate degree. So I went to a program in Colorado Springs at UCCS, which was a master's degree in sport nutrition. And while I was there, I had some unique opportunities in sport nutrition because the Olympic training center is there in Colorado Springs. So Rob Skinner, who's kind of done a lot of work in sport nutrition. He was the senior sport dietitian in acrobat and combat sports at the Olympic Training Center when I was there, or when I was in Colorado Springs. And so I was able to intern with him and get hours to sit for the board certification in sport dietetics. And then simultaneously, I got really interested in farming and the grain work that was being done in Colorado. And so I had a mentor, her name is Dr. Nana Meyer, and she puts on an event every year, which is still going on actually. They just started, so if anyone's interested, you can reach out to me and get information on this. But it's called UCCS Grain School, and now it was originally a 3-day intensive, like kind of hands-on conference, and now it's turned into a hybrid online, but also has some hands-on components for people that are in Colorado Springs. And anyways, she invited Dr. Stephen Jones to be the keynote speaker for that event. And he talked about the WSU Breadlab and the work that was going on there. And when I was just listening to his talk, I just felt that kind of farming work and regionalizing the grain economy was really meaningful and seemed purposeful. And it was something that I was really drawn to. And I decided to just ask him after his talk, like go up to him and said, like, would you ever consider taking a dietitian as a doctoral student? And he said yes. And so that's how I ended up here. And it's been a wonderful journey. So I'm excited to tell you about our lab. We are associated with WSU. However, we're not in Pullman, Eastern Washington. We're actually in Western Washington, about an hour-and-a-half drive north of Seattle. We were founded by Dr. Stephen Jones, who I just mentioned, in 2009. He was originally the winter wheat breeder for WSU, and he started in 1991, and he kind of, in his words, fell out of love with the commodity system And so in 2009 was given the opportunity to be the research director of the research station here in Mount Vernon. And our lab, WSU Breadlab, our mission is to increase the affordability, accessibility, and approachability of whole wheat baked products for as many members of our community as possible. We are, though, traditionally a wheat breeding lab. And I know at least this may have changed now as far as the curriculum goes, but when I was studying dietetics, this was not something we talked about at all, plant breeding. Essentially, plant breeders are the people that are, they're geneticists, and we're the ones that kind of in contact with seed, first stage of the food system. And so in wheat breeding, we're looking at, our lab uses only traditional crosses, only organic systems. And by traditional cross, I just mean that we take 2 wheat plants. One of them we remove the male parts and another one we remove the female parts. And then we literally just cross-pollinate them in the greenhouse. And this allows us to create new genetic diversity. And then we grow this out in the field and we select what works best, because we are breeding for varieties of wheat that work well in Western Washington. And then we also have on here, we focus on populations and land races. I'll get a little bit more into the nitty gritty of what that means, because this is in contrast to the commodity system. But essentially it means we're leaving genetic diversity in the field rather than creating pure monoculture lines of wheat. And something that we like to say in our lab is that we're out of place, because when you think of Western Washington, you don't typically think of wheat in the agriculture. People will think of Nebraska or Kansas as big wheat areas, same with Eastern Washington and the Palouse. However, in the Skagit Valley, we have over 80 crops grown here, yet wheat and barley are number 79 and number 80. So when Dr. Jones came to Western Washington from Pullman, he kind of thought maybe he would be getting out of wheat breeding. He thought maybe I'll do raspberries or potatoes or big crops in this area, high value. However, when he started to meet with the growers, they kept saying, no, we want you to work on wheat and barley and the grains, because we have to grow these crops to break disease cycles and to add nutrients back into the soil. However, we lose money typically. Like, these are a couple quotes from the growers. John Rusin said, when I grow wheat, I want to lose less money. And Dave Headland, organic grower in the area, said, I grow wheat for fun and sometimes profit. So a big part of what makes our lab unique is that we are breeding wheat for outside of the commodity system. So this kind of gives us freedom in the sense that we're able to establish our own breeding targets. So, and what I mean by the commodity system is wheat that is bred to be sold on the commodity market, and typically, leaving the country, so being exported to other countries. In order to be sold at that scale, wheat has to meet precise standards. So there are 6 classes of wheat: soft, hard, red, white, durum. And we kind of reject that notion because it ends up limiting what we can breed for. So they aren't thinking as much, they're thinking about yield. And we think about yield too, because we have to have high enough yield to bring the price point down, and also it has to work well for the farmers. But we have flexibility to breed for other targets, such as flavor, nutrition. We have, in this picture, you see a blue colored wheat. So we have students working on purple wheat and barley, blue wheat and barley, black wheat, perennial grains. And so there's just a lot more creativity that we're kind of allowed to do. But the thing that really makes us unique, and I think is most interest to dietitians, is the fact that we are breeding for whole grain uses. And, you would think that shouldn't be revolutionary, but it is. So most wheat is bred, or the person that is sort of designing the genetics for the grain that's going to be put in the food system, with low ash in mind, which means that when it's incinerated, you have essentially it's you have a less mineral content, which means you have the bran and the germ removed. So I'll get a little bit into that later, but the thing for you to remember is that we're breeding for whole grain uses, and this isn't typical. And this brought about this idea of building a regional grain economy and keeping value where it's produced. So we're proud of the fact that since the lab has been in Skagit Valley, we've contributed to the creation of state-of-the-art malting facilities, Skagit Valley Malting, 2 flour mills, several breweries, and according to the former executive director of our Port of Skagit, where our lab is located, Patsy Parton, our lab presence has led to the creation of over 250 living wage jobs. We like to call ourselves plant breeders who bake, and this is an aerial view of our trials in our research plots. So each of those is a 3x12 plot, and each little square is a different variety of grain. And so plant breeders, our role is really to select for the genetics that work well for the area. So it all depends on what you're looking for. But if you just look at this aerial view, you can see some of them are green, some of them are white, which means the green ones are kind of later to harvest, and the white ones mean they're kind of earlier. So depending on what trait you're looking for, you might keep the seed from the earlier ones or the later. That's one trait we might look for. If you're looking closer, you might notice that some of the varieties have awns, which are those little spikes that come out of the grain kernel. And a lot of breeders have selected against those because they're harder to clean and harvest, but then at the same time, they were an environmental trait that helps protect the grain from bird damage. So there's the beauty of plant breeding is that you really can select for whatever traits the area you're breeding for needs. And then this term plant breeders who bake, we use this because we are unique in that we bake with everything that we grow. So any variety that we grow that does well, has high yield, we also bake with in our lab to make sure that it works well for the baker. And now I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about what flour is and get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty of what I was talking about with the commodity system. When we think of flour, we're thinking of white flour. For all intents and purposes, white flour is flour. The point here is that, there's a reason that every time we go into a restaurant or a grocery store, white flour products are what is most prevalent. And that is because the commodity system has designed it that way. And plant breeders have been breeding for white flour uses. So they're designing, in essence, they're designing wheat that tastes better as white flour. And so we're trying to do the opposite. We're trying to breed for whole grain uses and breed for, wheat that works well with whole grain products and that tastes good with whole grain products. As I hear flour is compromising human health, that's kind of a strong statement, but we also know that as far as back as 1907, Norwegian sailors were getting sick with beriberi due to eating an exclusively white flour diet. And we also know that 98% of Americans do not eat the recommended intake of whole grains. I think maybe somebody is not, yeah, there we go. Okay. And also 74% exceed limits for refined grains. And like I said, as far as breeding targets go, essentially every wheat breeding program in the US and probably the world breeds for white flour breeding targets exclusively, with the exception of our lab. This is just kind of give you an idea of the stark contrast as a biscuit made with whole wheat flour versus white flour. This is from a paper from the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition. And I like this graph because it kind of gives a visual representation of what has been termed the fiber gap. Are you able to see my cursor there? This white space here on the right. But here, what they're showing is total carbohydrate intake on the left, carbohydrate from fiber on the right over time. And this paper was really emphasizing the fact that we had a decrease in carbohydrate intake in the 1960s, total carbohydrate, and now we're back to where we were in the early 1900s. However, carbohydrate from fiber has remained as low as it was in the 1960s. And this is not just an American phenomenon. It was also recently shown in the Eat Lancet Commission paper. So when we say the fiber gap, we're referring to is inadequate intake of fiber in both the US and worldwide. And as you probably are aware of, fiber intake recommendation in the US is actually quite low. So it's only 28 to 34 grams per day. And for reference, there's about 5 grams of fiber in 2 slices of whole wheat bread. And we know that 94% of Americans don't meet fiber needs. One thing I really like to emphasize here, is just that whenever I'm talking about this sort of idea, I'm not talking at the individual level. I never want to shame somebody for eating a pancake or a slice of white bread. We're talking about a systemic issue and the fact that there's a reason why the white flour products are more available. And a lot of times, especially as dietitians, we aren't really, at least I wasn't in my undergrad and internship, I wasn't taught that, that there was a specific systemic reason why whole wheat products were much more difficult to find. And I'm sure some of this is just review for this group, but I'll put a quick slide on the impact of dietary fiber on our gut microbiota. And we know that we need dietary fiber to make short-chain fatty acids in our gut, which play a role in regulating our metabolism and immune system. Thus, diets low in dietary fiber lead to decreased microbial diversity in our gut and a deterioration of a mucus layer, and increased risk of developing chronic inflammatory diseases, while diets high in fiber lead to more diverse and abundant short-chain fatty acids in our gut, which leads to improved immune responses. And by the chronic diseases we're talking about are specifically like diabetes, colon cancer, inflammatory bowel disease. Then there was also the Eat Lancet, or not Eat Lancet, the Global Burden of Disease study, which was published in the Lancet in 2019. And this was research out of University of Washington looking at leading dietary risk factors for death globally. And they found that low intake of whole grains was the leading dietary risk factor for mortality among women and the leading risk for death and disability adjusted life years among young adults. And they state in the paper, our findings will inform implementation of evidence-based dietary interventions. We believe at our lab then that it is our job as breeders and dietitians to intervene here. Just to summarize, we know that flour containing a higher percentage of the whole kernel has a positive impact on human health. And we know that using the entire kernel models best use of the land and equates to higher yield of human food per acre. And what I mean by this is, if we have, and I'll show you a little bit in pictures in a few more slides later, if we have a wheat kernel and what's typically done in the commodity system is removing the outer layer, the bran and the germ, that is anywhere from 25 to 30% of the grain. So when these mills remove that, they're actually lowering their yield by 25 to 30%, which is not best use of the land. So we talk a lot about in our lab how best use of the land is to use the entire kernel rather than selling off some of it to animal feed. And then we also believe that breeders can increase accessibility. So I kind of mentioned that plant breeders are unique in that they're typically the first ones in contact with the seed before it goes to the farmers. And so this is really a position of power as far as the food system goes. And so breeders have a power and responsibility, I would even say an obligation, to breed with human health in mind and to breed for whole grain flour. And you would think that that wouldn't be such a huge statement, but it really is. And it's, our system was designed for white flour. And so we're constantly having to sort of defend this position, I guess. And to give you a sense of the scale, so this is a miniature roller mill. And this is how most flour in the US is produced. So it goes through a series, is crushed through a series of rollers, and then goes through a sieve here, which separates the outer layers, the bran and the germ, from the endosperm, and basically just by particle size. So the bran and the germ typically end up being larger particles than the endosperm. And we know that most of the nutrition in wheat is found in this drawer here. So the dietary fiber, the B vitamins, the minerals, the healthy fats are over here. And my advisor, Dr. Jones, will often say this drawer, the white flour drawer, has about the nutritional content of a Q-tip. So we just have the starch and gluten over here. And let's see, this is just up close of the rollers. And to give you a sense of the scale here, 100 years ago, we had over 25,000 flour mills in the US. And now 19 mills produce enough flour for everyone in the US to have 165 grams of flour on average per day. So there's also a scale issue here. And we're seeing the creation of people returning to regional grain economies and through the creation of mid-sized mills. And many of them are stone mills, like is pictured here. This is one we have in our lab. It's a 26-inch New American stone mill. And these work by having two stones as opposed to the rollers, and one of the stones stays stationary and then the top one moves to grind the flour. And as long as there's no sifter, then you end up with whatever goes into the mill comes out. So 100% whole grain. And let's see. I also kind of like to emphasize that wheat is a very nutritious food. So oftentimes it can, or sometimes it is, especially with sort of the trends that we see in nutrition, people will kind of give wheat a bad reputation, but it actually has a wealth of nutrition. So we have the starch and the protein, which is what we often think of, but there are also the minerals and B vitamins, phytochemicals, phenolic compounds, antioxidants, fiber, which has been the focus of my work, and then healthy fats, as well as phytic acid. And I always like to really emphasize this. So what's inside a kernel of wheat, the endosperm, is just the starch and gluten, or starch and protein. And this, everything in red, is what we lose when we sift our flour. This is a picture of our seed room at our laboratory. And there's over 1,500 varieties of grain here. On the right side is mostly wheat, in the back is barley. The left, we have rye, buckwheat, and beans. And this is what we use as our starting germplasm. So it's kind of, if we're going to, if a new student comes to lab and let's say they're put on and their breeding program is going to be different colors of grains, which is what one of our students is working on. He came to this room and used the germplasm here to start his crosses, which I mentioned earlier. And so this is sort of just like a wealth of genetic variety that we can use in the breeding process. This is an up close image of our seed room. And then I also just think sometimes it's easy to forget how beautiful grains are. So I like these up close images. These are varieties that Robin Morgan, one of our students, is working on. This, you see the dark brown, blue, kind of a burgundy color. He's also working on black and spherical wheat. So different, a more round shaped wheat. And then this is really up close, just really showcasing the beauty. This is a colored club wheat, this segregating. And one kind of unique, this is our director of special projects is working on this one. Her name is Janine Sanguin, and that's another kind of special component of our lab is that every member of the lab has something in the field, even if they're not, they're not in a breeding role. We want to make sure that everybody knows how breeding works and how the whole process from seed to loaf of bread occurs. And it's also really fun to have things growing in the field and have something to take care of while you're going through, dissertation writing and things that maybe aren't quite so pleasant. If you can go back in the field, it kind of centers you and brings you back to the purpose and why we're here. This is some non-commodity barley that's in the field. I thought this one was really beautiful. One of our students, Louis Prager, is working on breeding non-commodity colored barley for whiskey distilling. And this is buckwheat flowering in the field. And more buckwheat. This image is one of my favorites. We like to call this one our buckwheat jungle. It's actually a relative of rhubarb. And then this is the buckwheat after we harvested. And then we also do a little work on beans as well. And I put here diversity in the field leading to diversity in the plate. And so I mentioned earlier that we favor land races. And that means that the genetic diversity left in the variety of wheat or other grain when we release it to the public. This is unique in that, when new wheat varieties are released within the commodity system, they have to be genetically pure. And because we're not selling or releasing wheat that is going to be sold on the commodity market, we're releasing wheat that farmers grow and then sell directly to smaller mills. We favor land races, and we do this for several reasons. One, we can release those quicker than when you create a genetically pure line. And also, when you leave genetic diversity in the field, it's a way to respond to a chaotic climate. So perhaps some of the genes might not work well with environmental pressure that the farmers find that year. Maybe it's a really hot, or there's less water, or we get a cold night that we weren't expecting. And then some of the genetics might respond really well to that. And that means that one, we don't have a total crop failure if there's some sort of environmental pressure that a pure line couldn't respond well to. And secondly, the population changes as it's harvested depending on where it's grown. So what works well is then what has a higher yield. And so that population, the next year the farmer plants it, is what, there's a higher concentration of those genetics in that population. So for example, we have one population that has been really popular with farmers here and also across the United States. It's called Skagit 1109. And, farmers that grow that variety in Washington, it ends up looking a lot different than when they grow it in Montana, where there's a different environmental pressure. So I think that we've really favored that way of breeding. And there's some cool papers on it if you're interested. I can give some papers to read. Then I said diversity in the field leads to diversity in the plate. And so, like I said, everything we breed for, we test in the lab, and we test using whole wheat in various products. So basically, we're of the mindset that we can bake anything with 100% whole wheat. And we've been successful in this. This left one is a whole wheat baguette, and the right is a product we've called the approachable loaf, which I'll talk a little bit more in a minute here. This is my advisor, Dr. Jones, making 100% whole grain pizza. And this is an addition we've had to the lab since I've been here. It's a buoy oven. So it's a pizza oven made with a World War II buoy from the Olympic Peninsula. And it's in there, it's lined with actually whiskey bottles as insulation. So it was a pretty cool project. Janine Sanguine, who I mentioned earlier, this was her first special project. So I think she has a pretty cool job. We also did 100% whole grain bagels in the buoy oven. And 100% whole grain croissants. This is the croissants definitely take a skilled baker. And These were made by Jeff Yankelo, who his kind of claim to fame, he's been a friend of the lab for years, but he was also part of the sort of Olympics of bread baking, the Coupe du Monde de Boulangerie. He was a member of the winning US team. And then these are 100% whole grain or biscuits. And we also do pies and cookies. And there's also recipes of all these, or many of these on our website if you're interested. Oftentimes the pastries end up being, like the pie crust and the cookies end up being a little bit easier because you can just swap them one for one in a lot of recipes. When there's so much butter or oil, it kind of favors an easier substitute. If you're doing baking and it's calls for all-purpose flour, oftentimes you just need to add more water because the bran will soak up a lot of the moisture. Let's see. And then I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of my dissertation work. And this started as, when I came to the lab, Dr. Jones kind of said, Merri, I want you to work on breeding wheat with a thicker layer of bran. And which is essentially the opposite of what breeders have been doing for the last 100 years, because they were trying to create wheat with more endosperm so they could create more white flour to increase the efficiency of the commodity system. And Dr. Jones said, I want you to do the exact opposite. So I started by going into that seed room where I showed you the germplasm, where we have all our germplasm. And I was literally just opening up and taking a razor blade and cutting seeds in half to see if I could visually see with a magnifying glass ones that had a thicker bran layer that I could use as starting germplasm in the breeding process. So I did that. I was in there for hours and hours. I sliced open over 600 wheat varieties, and I found 2 that looked like they had a thicker layer of bran. Grew those out in the field, but unfortunately they both were really susceptible to stripe rust, which is a fungus or disease that you don't want. And that's another aspect of plant breeding. If something is susceptible to disease, you throw it out. It's not going to work. And so I knew that those wouldn't work for Western Washington and was kind of at a loss for where to go with this project. And then one day, Dr. Jones kind of came into our office one day and was like, Merri, you've been spending all this time trying to increase the bran layer. How's that going for you? And I was like, well, it's not going that great. He was like, what if you decrease the endosperm? And so sometimes it's just a little bit of reframing that allows a project to take on a new direction. And that's where the idea for this project came, where we started looking at the economic and nutritional value of smaller wheat kernels. And this is all basic geometry, essentially. But to back up, in the wheat world, there's this term called 1,000 kernel weight. And that just refers to the weight of 1,000 kernels. And within the commodity system values a higher 1,000 kernel weight. And that's because it's going to produce more white flour. And we know that average 1,000 kernel weight has increased by about 2 grams per decade, with an average 1,000 kernel weight of about 32 grams in the 1940s to an average 1,000 kernel weight of about 45 grams in the 2000s. And this is a direct result of plant breeding. And because, as I said, larger kernel size results in greater white flour yield, which remains a primary breeding target. However, climate pressures are producing years and locations where the kernels are significantly smaller. And this is, smaller kernels have been shown to form in a response to inhibited starch deposition from heat and drought stress. So we're finding, especially in Washington, we've had 2 low rainfall summers with high heat. When we're finding a lot of our farmers talking to us about this, that their kernels were just much smaller. And so we thought, rather than frame this as a negative, perhaps it could be a good thing. And so this is from the idea of the square cube law, which is principle originally described by Galileo Galilei in the 2 New Sciences, where he states that the surface of a small solid is comparatively greater than that of a large one. So the concept being, as the volume of a shape increases, the surface area decreases in relation to that increase in volume. So applied to a wheat kernel, we were thinking, okay, as the wheat kernel increased, then the bran probably is decreasing. It's just like ratios. Given that 98% of the dietary fiber in wheat is found in the bran, we can infer by principles of the square cube law that small kernels contain more total grams of dietary fiber per kernel than large kernels. And so then we decided, how can we kind of validate this in the lab? And this project, we took 9 different varieties of wheat and then separated them by large and small grains, using the sieve size that a large seed cleaner would use. So essentially saying that all the smalls are the ones that would be rejected and used as animal feed. So we separated them and labeled them bigs and smalls. And then we milled 500-gram samples on that roller mill I showed you of bigs versus smalls of these 9 varieties of grain, and weighed out the proportion of bran per total flour weight to determine percent bran of each sample, and found that on average, the smalls had about 16% more bran than the bigs, meaning more fiber, more minerals, more vitamins. And then the question was, can we bake with it, with these small kernels? And we found that yes, we can. So these are test bakes here. 3 and 5 were made using big kernels, and then 4 and 6 were made using small kernels. And so we found about a 2 millimeter difference in loaf height, which is a measurement that the bakers use to determine baking quality. And we're told by professional bakers that this was pretty negligible difference. And then we also, these were miniature loaves because we didn't have a lot of seed, but then we also expanded the project with bigger loaves. And this was a loaf made with bigs of that 1109 variety I mentioned earlier. And then this number 2 is made with this sample that we got from a commercial craft mill, and they actually labeled it chicken feed. So this was all grain that would be sold as chicken feed at a lower price. And we were able to make really beautiful bread with it. And so part of this paper that we ended up publishing here is in the title Climate Changed Wheat, the Effect of Smaller Kernels on the Nutritional Value of Wheat. It's sort of philosophical in the sense that we're not saying that you need to breed for smaller kernels. We're saying smaller kernels are going to happen, and it's only going to get worse as the climate pressures increase. So it's kind of a call to action on farmers and millers and the whole grain chain system, that we need to start valuing these smaller kernels, that we can bake with them. They're actually more nutritious. And if you sell them as animal feed, it's a 30% efficiency versus 100% efficiency to use as human food. So that has been one of the chapters of my dissertation. And I also wanted to briefly talk about another project that we are working on called the Approachable Loaf Project. And this came about sort of, I think around 2018 when this project started. We were doing a lot of baking classes that were sort of artisan baking classes, and we would end up having lots of loaves left over, and we would donate them to the food bank. And there were those artisan, like, crunchy loaves of bread. And after a while, they told us, actually, you can stop bringing these loaves. Like, no one's really taking them. And we realized it just isn't really what a lot of people think of as bread in America. Oftentimes we think of that soft, squishy loaf. However, the bread industry has some philosophical issues that we wanted to try to kind of provide an alternative to. So this is a loaf of soft, squishy bread that had a sell-by date of June 3rd, 2018. And we had it in our lab for over a year. And this picture was taken at little bit over a year, and there was still no mold, and it kind of led us to the idea that bread really is supposed to go bad. And so what is in there that is causing it to last so long? And that is the preservatives, emulsifiers. And then the other component here is that they remove the ingredient of thyme from the industrial bread making process. So rather than, we only need 4 ingredients to make bread: flour, water, sourdough starter, and salt. But if you look on a bag of grocery store bread, typically there's over 26 ingredients. And they do this as a way to be able to remove the ingredient of thyme and create more loaves of bread, so that they can sell more bread. It's like a financial thing. However, there's several, we kind of like take the philosophy of like, we don't want any non-food in our bread. And there's also a component of they often add vital wheat gluten. And there are some people that have like theorizing that could be why we're seeing an increase of gluten sensitivities, is because we're not fermenting bread, which can make bread easier to digest, and then we're also adding it, kind of supercharging it with gluten instead of fermenting, which is another way to produce the gluten structure. And so our response to this was a project we called the Breadlab Collective, and we created this approachable loaf project where we could have no more than 7 ingredients and no non-food. It has to be 60 to 100% whole wheat. I'm kind of pushing for 100%, but I've been told by my team that we need to have it compromise and help bring people in, because a lot of people, just 60% whole wheat is a big push for them. And this was originally priced under $6 a loaf. However, we recently had to raise that because the bakeries that were selling it were telling us that they just couldn't meet their labor and food costs with that price in some of the locations. So depending on locations, it could be up as much as $8. It's now in 29 states and 6 countries. We also have the formula freely available on our website, with videos on how to make it as well. And we always encourage folks to give that a try. Then I also wanted to mention some of the other students that I get to work with. We have a really great team. This is Robin Morgan, who I mentioned earlier. He came to us from Italy, actually, and he was a former chef, and then got interested in farming, worked on the farm for a little bit, and then got his master's in breeding emmer in organic agriculture. He's now working on perennial wheat, breeding for blue, purple, and black wheat, and then that spherical wheat that I mentioned earlier. He is funded by Sandy Arrow Ranch in Montana. This is Louis Prager, who I mentioned is working on the non-commodity purple and different colors of barley for whiskey distilling. He was actually originally a baker, so he started a bakery called Prager Brothers in San Diego, and has been, successful on that avenue, but kind of wanted to look at the other side of things. And so he is now doing his PhD in barley breeding, and he's funded by Westland Distillery, which is in Seattle. Oh, I missed Laura. Laura is our anthropologist. So she's from Estonia, and she is looking at the meaning of rye and kind of how rye as an underutilized crop in the US. It's actually higher in fiber than wheat. But yet it's, a lot of times when people think of rye bread in the US, they think of caraway and they are kind of turned off by it. But most rye doesn't have to have caraway. And also a lot of the rye in the US is made with majority wheat, just a touch of rye. And so she's kind of working on, why is that the way it is in the US, and can it be changed, and how can we kind of leverage rye to be a larger part of our food system. It's also, we always, rye is unique in that it's very tall, and when we grow it in the field, there's 4 students and 3 of us are working on either barley or wheat. And we're always a little bit envious of Laura because her crop requires much less weeding than ours, because it grows tall and it shades the weeds so they don't grow, kind of outcompetes them. Whereas the wheat and barley folks, Robin, Louie, and I are doing a ton of weeding. And so we're kind of like, why doesn't everybody just grow rye? It makes a lot of sense. And one other aspect, as a university, part of a university, we are public servants. And so something that's unique about our program is that we really get an opportunity to be a part of the community. We do bakes for the Friendship House on a regular basis. Over the pandemic, one of our partners, because we share a facility with King Arthur Baking School, and so along with the baking school, we were able to bake 6,000 approachable loaves during the pandemic and donate those to the Friendship House. We kind of something that's been a passion project of mine has been this course I've been teaching called Whole Grain Researchers. And this is for students or teachers in the Washington area. They kind of came to us with a need because they have a requirement to have, I think, 15 continuing education credits that are in the area of STEM to keep their teaching credential. And they didn't have a way to meet those units. And so they came to us, asked if someone would teach a course. And this was during the pandemic. And so I did the first version of this virtually. And we had 120 or over 120 teachers participate. And this was once a week for about an hour for a month. And then they had an hour of at-home projects that they worked on in between each week. So that was really successful. And then last August, we did our first in-person course, which was also a lot of fun. And the teachers gave us really great feedback. And so we're hoping to do this again on a larger scale this summer too. And one final note, another project we've been working on is something called Pizza for Producers. And so this came about in a collaboration with the Washington State University Extension, which is right next door to our facility in the Porter Skagit. And they've been working on programs for stress reduction with farmers. So there's a lot of correlation between increased depression and anxiety and the kind of mental health stuff with farmers and those involved in agriculture. And so we did the inaugural Pizza for Producers event, which was with extension agents. And we taught them how to build a pizza oven, which with the idea that they'll now go to the farmers they work with and build a pizza oven together, and then have regular events where they are centered around building community and sharing pizza together. And I think that's my last slide. Oh, I always like to mention, thank you to our partners. We like to say that we have partners and not donors. This is a partial list. It's always changing of the people that we partner with. We also like to say that we partner with people we don't have to apologize for. So everyone on this list has the same ideas in mind. They're climate friendly. Other than the whiskey, they are affordable. They range from the bakery north of the Arctic Circle in Sweden, Polarbrod, who in their words are a 150 woman-run bakery, to Grand Central, which is here in Seattle. We also have our wheat on the farm at Yale University. As I was told recently, it's now at University of Washington. And we have an endowment with Cliff Bar and King Arthur, which has been, we're very thankful for. And then I wanted to leave you with, this is an anonymous artist hand delivered. We had a baker, Kimberly Bell, who owns Small Food Bakery in Nottingham, deliver this from a graffiti artist in Nottingham. And it just says, "Whose bread is this?" But I really liked her quote and I wanted to share it with you as kind of a closing statement. So, increasingly, there is much to question about who holds power, who are custodians of our seeds, who gets to give them out, who controls the infrastructure to turn them into food, who labors to do the work, who decides how knowledge is disseminated. How does all of that filter out to ensure that everyone is nourished? Things got really complicated complicated. It's going to take all of us to wonder whose bread is this. So thank you. And I think we have about 10 minutes if you have any questions or that sort of thing. I'll stop my share here.
Thank you, Merri. Any questions? There's some.
How do you define
Yeah.
food versus non-food ingredients? One of the really quick ways to do it is things you can pronounce. We'll often tell people that, and that's probably the way I would define it. You know, the more to speak on a notion of considering that all of you are dietitians or future dietitians, I do realize that there's a lot of nuance here and it's complicated. And so I never want to demonize a food. So, you know, like personally, even myself, there's times where I'm going to have quote unquote non-food ingredients because it's such a big part of our food system. So my point, or our point, is really never that an individual should feel bad or guilty about eating a certain food, but it's just taking into consideration, like, why is that product used in the first place? And is it in the best interest of the individual and the community as a whole? Oftentimes, those products are used to benefit industry financially. And so we are saying that in the sense of like, you know, who was this wheat really designed for, if that makes sense?
Can you talk about the land race? I didn't really understand what you were saying.
Oh yeah, okay. So land race, and then the term populations is also used. And that just means that there's genetic diversity left in the wheat varieties. So when you first, so like I said, like the first step of breeding, it's actually like pretty simple. Like all of you could do it if you wanted to, just at home as a hobby. If you watched a little video on like how to cross wheat, but you take 2 wheat plants that are at a certain stage in the growing process, and then you emasculate with them essentially. So you remove the male parts from one and you remove the female parts from another, and then you literally just shake them together. And so that leaves genetic diversity in the seeds. But at that point in the process, when you grow those new seeds out in the field, they're all going to be different. So some of the kernels that form will have different genetics than other kernels, even though they were like on the same wheat head when you cross them. And so there's a process of selecting and then recrossing in plant breeding that slowly over time you create a wheat that only has the same genetics. So if you plant that seed time and time again, it will be exactly the same. And the commodity system, in order for a variety to be officially released, to be sold, it has to have the same genetics. And we favor not doing that. We favor leaving the diversity there. And we feel that allows for more climate resilience. And it's also, in our opinion, in our opinion, it's beautiful too. And we like to leave that diversity there.
So you're saying when you grow the wheat, it has a lot of like kernels, and you're saying all the kernels have different genetics.
Mm-hmm.
But they say all the kernels have to be the same.
Yeah, and that process takes more time.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't want to overcomplicate it, but
that's
but we, you know, land races work well for us because it's quicker, and then it also, we think, is a really good response to a changing climate. So
that's the ones with different kernels are called land race.
When you leave genetic diversity there. So it's a little bit confusing actually. But yeah, that's a good summary, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I think there might be questions in the chat. Let's see. Do you have any suggestions for someone interested in getting involved in a similar career path? Yeah, I think for me, well, the first thing that was, I did work on a farm for a summer, and that was really helpful to learn the how food is grown. I know a lot of you that might be included in your internship. Is that correct, Nancy? That there's like work on farms in this internship? Yeah.
Part of it is gardening at least, or somehow being in the dirt.
That is, I did not have that experience in my internship. It was very clinically focused. So that's wonderful that you're already kind of doing that. And then I think, I mentioned grain school was my kind of introduction, and so that would be a perfect opportunity right now because it just started. So they're in their third class. I think you could still sign up. Let's see if I can find the link to that. I'll send it to Nancy and then she can share it with you all. But that is a 3-month online course, which is all focused on increasing grain literacy. The first month, which is they've done 2 weeks now, so next week will be the third week. It's focused on farming. Then the second month is focused on nutrition, and the third is on community health or community outreach. And they do have scholarships available, so I'm sure that they would love to have more dietitians in that class or future dietitians. So that would be a really great way. That's all located in Colorado, or the hub of the education. But they have a lot of great resources in that class. So I think that if if that was something you were interested in, it's every Thursday. I think it's 4:30 to 6 Mountain Time. So that would be 3:30 to 5 Pacific Time, but that's one outlet. If you're in Washington, we've just started doing pop-ups at our lab once a month, so that if you wanted to follow our Instagram and kind of come to the lab, that would be an opportunity to stop by. The next one, I think Mel Derbyshire from Grand Central is going to be leading. We don't have a date for it yet, but it's going to be in March. It'll be announced on our Instagram.
Great, thanks. So we can, they can email you if they have other questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate you coming so much. Thank you for sharing and putting together the slide deck and sharing your journey.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. And so I told them all when they come to town, we'll make a road trip.
Okay.
Come up and see you. So we're going to transition